Today's presentation is going to be on the forces at play. Firstly, the elusive obvious is something I wanted to mention because it's a very important concept, and it really means the simple truths or habits that are so familiar, they're easy to overlook. They're right in front of us, but we don't notice them because they've become automatic. And a classic example is around facts. And facts are stubborn, but not as stubborn as some minds. So facts rarely change people's opinions because beliefs are shaped by emotions, identity, group loyalty. It's not just logic or evidence, or our evidence is important. And during one of the presentations a few years ago, I asked a question to the group, which was, how successful has sharing facts and information been in changing people's minds? And they laughed, and one of them realized it just wasn't working at all, and then really paid attention and then completely changed the way that they approached influencing people, and they had a major effect by then, and they had their own channel influencing a lot of people and councils. It's not about the information, but we're so habitual in thinking information is the key that it's only when we become conscious, when that elusive obvious we become aware of it, that things will change. And I think the forces at play, a lot of those come under the elusive obvious, that when you become aware of them, they become so obvious that you can't ignore them anymore, and then you're influencing people and having an effect on general outcomes goes up significantly. Now, one thing as a metaphor I want to introduce, and it's really kind of key, and I call it the control room. So if you imagine any major station, let's say King's Cross in rush hour, if you were standing on the balcony and looked down, it would look like absolute chaos. You know, tens of thousands of people going in all different directions. But if you took any one person and looked at that one person, that person would have an outcome or a place they'd go in. A few people might be lost, but they'd still have the outcome of finding out where they need to be. Now, if that person's in control of themselves, then they're going in a direction they want to go. If somebody on that balcony understands where all these people are going, understands what motivates them more than they understand themselves, then those people can start controlling the crowd. And that's what we're seeing with, you know, wealthy, powerful people and governments, institutions, corporations, is that they are starting to control people more than people are controlling themselves. And it's reached a point that's so obvious now that I think we really have to take back control of our power. Now, one of the real problematic forces is if people are driven by things that they don't know or can't see, then they're going to be unaware of that. If corporations can see them better than the person can see, then we have a major problem. And I think that's where we are. And a classic example of controlling and sort of a government social engineering is this Mindspace document, which I highly recommend people to look into. You can get a free copy by just searching government and Mindspace. And it's the UK's document, and pretty much these nudge departments, as they're known, which are a collection of behavioural scientists working for the governments, is in every government in the world now. And the UK was one of the major drivers of these offices that appear in all of these governments. Now, in the Mindspace, they talk about 9 behavioural effects, 9 forces, as you were, that will affect people's behaviour and thinking. So what you have is that the government now considers itself to be sort of the governor of people. It should actually do the thinking for them. And if you see the bottom part of that quote, often influencing decisions automatically with a paternal intent, but without removing individual choice. Now that's highly questionable now. That's the sort of sales pitch. So I think we can see now that there's a large number of the population, and more people becoming aware that are being influenced and having their minds hijacked in many instances, and they're not aware that that is happening. They are stating very strong opinions about subjects, and they're not aware that they're probably not their own opinions. So we're at a real choice point in society, but I think it's, in some ways, it's good because it reveals itself. And that's what's happened in the last few years, is the social engineers have really been showing their hands. So one of the things we want to look at is how do we understand the forces at play? And once we understand those, then we can really start to understand people a lot better. Now, within organizations, one of the main ways to understand the forces at play come from a field called force field analysis. And it comes from Kurt Levine, who is one of the sort of founding fathers of psychology, really. And he stated that something will change, move towards its desired state, when the driving forces are greater than the restraining forces. So, and you'll see that in people's behavior, that they will carry on doing what they're doing until, the pain of staying the same outweighs the pain of changing. And that's generally when you only see change in people. It doesn't have to be that way when you understand how change and forces work. So a basic example would be a tug of war. So the driving force would be the players on your team pulling towards a goal, and then the opposing force, or the restraining force, would be the other team pulling towards their goal. And that's a very simple physical example of a driving force and an opposing force. Now, if we look at a case example of behavior that went crazy, and it's at Wells Fargo, which is a US bank, what happened was, because of the way that they set up the incentive scheme, their employees created about 3.5 million fake accounts without customer consent to meet sales targets. This resulted in, I think it was 5,300 employees committed fraud, which is unfathomable to think about how that can happen. And the company paid billions in fines and suffered, reputational harm that was lasting a long while. Now, incentives played a major force in that behavior, because the behavior was that in order to earn the income to live and survive, people then had to basically bend the rules. And incentives are so powerful that often incentives will change the direction of travel in someone's behavior. So those, there's the old quote, the person that chooses the song is really going to dictate what gets played. So if we look at the forces at play at Wells Fargo, the driving forces for the bad behavior were sales quotas. There were bonuses and incentives to act in that way. There was managerial pressure because the manager's bonuses also depended on it. And then you had this ambiguous ethics that it was really seen as being okay to do that. The restraining forces, the regulatory agencies, well, as we know from a lot of the systems, they're really not doing a very good job in any instance. Customer complaints, obviously that played a role, but that was just ignored. Whistleblowing, now lots of laws now are not helping whistleblowers, and the legal risk, and of course that was delayed. So what you had was that the force to commit fraud was a lot stronger than the restraining force. And if you think in society, a lot of the time we kind of think that the prison is a deterrent to bad behavior. But the reality of it is that good people don't need laws and bad people will find a way around them. Often the systems themselves and the driving forces that will control most people's behavior. Not many people are able to override the forces. And if you think about the last 5 years, pretty sure that everyone on this call went against the tide, went against the flow. And of course that wasn't easy. And those that went with the flow, with the current, obviously that's a lot easier, but it had a lot of, huge downside, didn't it? So when driving forces exceed the restraining forces, then a change will incur. And particularly in our own lives, this is so important to understand, because we can design solutions that will work rather than the solutions that won't work. And we're very good at deceiving ourselves. So an alcoholic will wake up every day and probably be confident and say, this is the last day I have a drink. So when we start to understand ourselves better and the forces at play, then we will have a lot more success. So as an example, the forces at play in the fitness regime. So a driving force might be health improvement, desire for more energy, desire to look better. But of course, there's going to be some restraining forces, which will be a lack of time, low motivation for many, anticipated discomfort, social circle habits. That could be a positive as well, cost and ease. But of course, when you start to map these out, then you can start to manage them. So a lack of time, you may be able to design a routine that's very quick at home, increasing the chances you'll do it. Motivation, you can actually increase motivation. There's many ways to do that. The anticipated discomfort, you can actually start to enjoy exercise. It is, a lot of people get a real buzz off it. So of course there's ways to build that up. Social circle habits, so obviously you can have that as a positive if you're hanging around with healthy people. If you say to your social circle, like, I really want to get fit, can you help me out? That can then become a driving force. So when you start to map them out and then look at them one by one, you can really start to manage them and change their effect if they're negative. Now, the last one there, ease, is really one of the most important things, and I'll address that in a slide in a little while. But there are many ways that once you start to map these out, you can really improve your success. Now, hidden forces at play, I think, are probably more important than the forces that we can see. And a lot of the hidden forces at play, the person that's actually behaving won't often be aware of these in themselves. And the quantum leap, as I like to call it, is what happened in behavioral science the last few decades, is that they stopped listening to what people said and they started watching what they did. That was a lot more reliable. Because a lot of the time people don't understand their own motivations. They don't understand their own drives, particularly if they're in hidden parts of their mind. There could be unconscious processes, situational pressures, etc., that we're not aware of. Now, if you look at this classic example in one of Jonah Berger's book, where he shares a memorable story about his father, who's actually a lawyer in Washington, D.C. And they did this study about all people driving BMWs and lawyers, etc. And to illustrate how people tend to recognize the power of social influence on others, but they don't often acknowledge it in themselves. So Berger's father once complained that DC lawyers are notorious conformists. As soon as they make partner, they all buy new BMWs. And then Berger pointed out, but Dad, you've got a BMW. He says, yeah, but they all drive grey ones. I drive a blue one. And what people find is that they can see these unconscious motivation in other people, but they often can't see them in themselves. So when we look at the need to, want to buy a BMW, and we look at these driving forces, a lot of them are often hidden, which is wanting to signal career success, peer imitation to copy the other lawyers, belief in unique taste, and maintaining this in-group trust. And obviously there's some restraining forces there. But the fascinating thing with these hidden forces at play, people can often see them in others, but not themselves. And I'm sure you've all seen them throughout the last 5 years show up in people, even people that knew that were going on, because it's not easy to see these blind spots in yourself. Sam, come here. Okay, so this next slide is really the key part of the presentation, which is why others just follow along, which is the forces at play in compliance. And now this is quite a long list, but it's not an exhaustive list, and I'll just go through a few of them. Is that social norms, and obviously you can look at these one by one on the replay, but people comply with what others are doing or what is perceived as normal. Now, many people that like to be unique will say, no, I don't. But we often do. I mean, look at how we dress. How many of us put on something really, really bizarre, and walk around? We generally will, act in a way very similar to social norms. We, particularly in the UK, we want to say please and thank you a lot. We're notorious for that. And if someone doesn't say it, then we tend to get angry. And this is just the social norms. It's almost the agreed ways to act. But if somebody influences those and creates some really bizarre norms, as we're seeing quite often, you're going to see a lot of people comply with them, even if they're crazy, because they want to fit into the group. Authority, so many people listen, trust the experts was pushed so often, and they don't realize they're doing it. It's so unconscious. I think there was the social experiment guy where he put on a yellow vest and grabbed a tannoy, walked into Hyde Park and just started shouting orders at people, and they just did as they were told. All he did was buy a yellow vest and grab a tannoy. So it's very important to understand these things. And if you look on the restraining forces, there'll be a few people on this call, including myself, that will often have what's known as a polarity response. When someone tells you to do something, you almost want to say, no, I'm not going to do what I do as I'm told. But of course, the ideal situation is to do what we want to do without responding to another's request. So these driving forces are so key, particularly the desire for approval. I mean, how many people keep complying with ridiculous requests just because they think that others are doing it and they're going to get well done if they do comply? So what you'll see is that a lot of these forces will be the things that, gain compliance for people requesting compliance, but a lot of it goes as stealth. People won't notice, and that's why they become so powerful. And if you look at all of these, and I have put an article on the website about how people were sort of trained like animals, as it were, to respond unconsciously during the lockdowns to requests. But yeah, I would go through each of those, and when you look at those, you'll see how people are manipulated and influenced in many different ways. So one thing I'm going to touch on is the path of least resistance, and I will do a call purely on this because it's so powerful. Is that the most powerful force in behavior is known as ease, how easy something is. And that could be classed as the path of least resistance. This is why habit is so powerful. This is why defaults is so powerful. I mean, you look at pensions. Most people's pensions are so important to their future, but yet very few people actually choose the best pension. They often just stick with the default. So, the path of least resistance is such a powerful thing. So if energy conservation and the path of least resistance is so important and so powerful, why do people run marathons and jump out of functioning airplanes? Which is a very good question. It's called the effort paradox. So one of the most driving forces is the conservation of energy, but this will be overridden when people seek challenges and push themselves, when rewards or meaning are strong. So rewards and punishments is what will pull people out of sitting on the couch doing nothing. Because that really is a lot of the time the default for the brain, is it wants to conserve energy. Hard-won achievements feel more valuable and enjoyable as effort triggers pride and pleasure chemicals in the brain. So this, you've only got to look at how society is structured to see how this works. And then of course social rewards, group status, and fear of missing out over flip effort from aversive to desirable. This is why people chase tough goals. So the key really is here is that people move toward pleasure and away from pain. If someone's goals seem painful, they won't move towards them. This really explains it. So when you ask someone to write down their goals, if they're not lit up like a Christmas tree, there's not much chance they're going to move towards that. The interesting thing is that's perceived pain and pleasure, which again is just a result of a lot of the time conditioning, which is there's people that will eat rubbish food because they've been conditioned to think it's pleasurable, and vice versa. So in summary, understanding the forces at play enables us to comprehend better why people behave as they do. It's really important to understand that, because over the next couple of months, I'm going to go through a model to understand behavior. And one of the most important things to understand in that model is the forces at play. And the hidden forces at play have a significant influence on behavior and act as a stealth influence in many instances. And mapping out the forces, increasing the driving forces and reducing friction or the restraining forces can have a significant effect on results. So I hope this really becomes apparent how it's such a simple concept in mapping out these behaviors, but due to the elusive obvious, it is very revealing, and you'll see a lot of the time, certainly in hindsight, why certain things worked and why other things didn't work, and particularly with the campaigns and wanting to influence others, I think you'll start to really understand why some people would just switch off and others would not. So that concludes today's presentation on the forces at play. This has been recorded, will be uploaded to the YouTube channel and shared, so you can rewatch it at your leisure. So now I'm going to stop recording and then open for questions.